And I'll just quote, "Herbal therapies are at least as effective as rifaximin for resolution of SIBO." You're often going to see oregano oil, peppermint, black walnut, olive leaf, and or berberine. So continuing within bacterial overgrowth, we can also fight fire with fire, so to speak. Probiotics, even though they are bacteria, except for Saccharomyces, which is actually a fungus, so it's one type of probiotic. But for the most part, probiotics are bacteria. Yet, probiotics are also potent antibacterials. There are numerous clinical trials showing that probiotics can treat successfully SIBO. In fact, some systematic reviews comparing the antibiotic rifaximin against probiotics show equivalency, roughly 50% response rate or resolution rate, either using the antibiotic rifaximin or using probiotics for bacterial overgrowth. But what about regularity? What about constipation? That's what I really care about. That's why I'm listening to this podcast, watching this video. There are also numerous clinical trials that have found various types, or as we call them, categories of probiotics improve constipation, even going so far as meta-analysis level data showing that probiotics improve constipation. Thus, we come to the evidence-based meta protocol we've been developing for years now. You have 3 types of probiotics, blends of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. Your dose there, 1 to 50 billion CFU per day. Or you have a fungus, Saccharomyces boulardii or Saccharomyces cerevisiae, dosed at 10 to 15 billion or 4 to 8 billion CFU per day, respectively. And then finally, the soil-based probiotics. These are bacillus species, generally speaking, 2 to 6 billion per day. And the duration here comes back to a point I made earlier. Some trials have found that you will not see a response in constipation until the 2nd or 3rd month. So it might be a little bit of a latent impact. And perhaps what's happening is as the probiotics are fighting the bacterial overgrowth and reducing leaky gut, it takes time for those impacts to then generate an improvement on motility, thus why it may take 2 to 3 months to see a full response from the probiotics. If you do have bacterial overgrowth, you've probably heard of antimicrobials. And coming back to rifaximin, the antibiotic, there was a really seminal paper by Jerry Mullins, who is at Johns Hopkins, comparing rifaximin, the antibiotic for SIBO, against herbal antimicrobials. And I'll just quote, "Herbal therapies are at least as effective as rifaximin for resolution of SIBO." You can use either tool, just wanting to make the point that while the research here may be a bit more nascent compared to drug and pharmaceutical funded research, there is still exciting preliminary data. And I would just quickly ask you to comment and subscribe. Your support has a very palpable impact on our channel's ability to reach and to help people. So any help is greatly appreciated. You're often going to see oregano oil, peppermint, black walnut, olive leaf, and or berberine. And I'll also share the data from our clinic. This is going back plus 5 years, and we finally analyzed this data, and it's currently in peer review for publication. So hopefully it'll be published Q3 of 2024. But essentially, we used 2 different approaches of herbal SIBO treatment, and we documented about a 40% resolution rate of SIBO breath testing with either approach. So the good news there is whether you're using something more fancy, herbals plus biofilm degrading agents, or just herbals alone, you're looking at about a 40% response rate, which is fairly consistent with the other data on rifaximin, about a 50% resolution rate, or probiotics, about a 50% resolution rate. So looking at multiple data points, you're seeing, roughly speaking, about 50-ish% resolution rate of SIBO or bacterial overgrowth with these various tools. Another protocol or approach that I'm actually excited about, and we came across recently, thank you, Allison Siebecker. And if you want to see the recent interview with her, this is where she introduced what originally came from Dr. Kathleen Janelle of using a high dose sulfur, MSM, methyl sulfonyl methane, for people with bloating, distension, and constipation. There's no published research here, at least to my knowledge. This is purely clinicians in the trenches experimenting and reporting what's working. Now, the challenge here, the huge challenge here potentially, is bias, right? If you're a clinician and you're super excited about this protocol, there's a number of things that can confound, your read. You might be putting someone on low FODMAP, magnesium, probiotics, and this sulfur protocol. And if you're not careful with your diligency, you may then say, oh my goodness, look, this MSM protocol was super effective for constipation, but you didn't factor out the other interventions. So we do want to be cautious with this. However, great news, and a thank you to friend and colleague, Dr. Alana Gurovich, who's also been on the podcast in the past. She has tested this and verified she's seeing efficacy. And so this is something that we're starting to experiment with in the clinic ourselves. The protocol goes as follows. You start with half a teaspoon of MSM, and you gradually increase up to 2 tablespoons per day, which would be 30 grams. You stop after 2 months, and if your symptoms return, you can go back onto a half a teaspoon. So new protocol, something to consider. So we've talked about bacterial overgrowth, and we've also talked about some of these structural abnormalities. For both of these, my view is that an elemental diet is another tool that can be helpful, especially for bacterial overgrowth. There's the Hallmark study by Mark Pimentel and colleagues that found, I believe it was about an 80-ish% resolution rate of both a SIBO breath test and IBS symptoms when using an elemental diet. An elemental diet is a meal replacement that is liquid, and it is very, very almost no fiber or prebiotics. What this does is it starves overgrowths. So if you do have a bacterial overgrowth, one of the ways that you can help remedy that is by this liquid medical food, if you will, that can starve overgrowth. And without going too far afield here, I think a practical way, a simpler way of using this is not to do what Mark Pimentel did, which was 2 weeks exclusively. My view is that's too high of a bar, but instead we can use it as a reset. 1 to 4 days in duration seems to be enough to quell symptoms and get most people moving. So you do it generally, mostly exclusively 1 to 4 days. And then from there, you can replace 1 or 2 meals per day. What's my evidence for that? A drove of clinical trials in inflammatory bowel disease showing reduced inflammation and reduced disease activity when using the elemental diet to replace roughly half of one's calories per day. Another thing that we should just touch on briefly underneath sort of the umbrella of bacterial overgrowth is motility and autoimmunity to the motility apparatus in the gut. You may have heard this post-infectious IBS syndrome, where someone has a bout of food poisoning or traveler's diarrhea. That acute episode clears, but in the wake of that, people have residual symptoms ongoing. And what can happen here is that initial bout of acute gastroenteritis or food poisoning then creates an autoimmune attack against the motility apparatus in the gut, and this can lead to IBS and bacterial overgrowth. What is interesting is that the people with constipation don't tend to have the autoimmunity. So the autoimmune hypothesis doesn't fully account for constipation. But what we can take away from this that is helpful is a prokinetic. Prokinetics are one proposed treatment for that autoimmunity. But putting that aside, if we look at people with constipation who were not responsive to laxatives or to dietary and lifestyle interventions, one of the most effective therapeutics is Resilord, aka precalipride.